If you feel like the world is shifting under your feet right now, well, you're absolutely right. The sheer volume, the velocity of global updates, it suggests we're not just changing, we're accelerating.
Mm.
Accelerating past the point where, the old models can keep up. Geopolitics, finance, even biology.
That's really the common thread in the sources we looked at for this deep dive. Our goal here is to cut through the noise, give you a shortcut to understanding these critical shifts, often counterintuitive ones. We're examining things that maybe simmered for years, but now they're bursting into, well, potentially irreversible acceleration.
Okay, so let's start where those traditional models seem to be failing pretty dramatically. The U.S.-Israel relationship. It wasn't long ago Benjamin Netanyahu said the alliance was as strong and as durable as the stones of the Western Wall.
A powerful image. But tragically, maybe inaccurate, given what the polling inside the U.S. is showing. This isn't just, a spat between leaders. It looks much more like a fundamental structural shift in American public opinion. And once those shifts gain momentum, they're very hard to reverse.
Let's get into those numbers because they really are astonishing. The share of Americans backing Israel over the Palestinians, it's hit a 25-year low. And maybe more significantly, over half of American adults, 53%, now hold an unfavorable view of Israel. That's jumped up from 42% just 2 years ago in 2022, a huge leap.
Right, an 11-point surge. And that unfavorable view, it's digging deep into core American political loyalties. That's why it feels structural. And look at this data point. It sort of reframes the whole domestic debate. 43% of all Americans now believe Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. When that belief takes hold, it impacts everything: funding, diplomatic options, political risk. It's a different landscape.
What's really surprising, I think, is that it's not just one side of the political spectrum.
Mhm.
Negative views among Democrats over 50, they surged 23 points in just 3 years. But then look at Republicans under 50. Support is now nearly evenly split. That's down from 63% support in 2022, a massive drop. We're even seeing it decline among young evangelicals.
Exactly. And that decline among historically, very staunch supporters opens the door for voices that used to be on the fringe. Isolationist voices. You now have really high-profile figures in the MAGA movement. Marjorie Taylor Greene, Steve Bannon, Tucker Carlson, arguing that unconditional support for Israel actually contradicts America first.
So their argument becomes, why are American tax dollars funding this conflict if it doesn't put America first?
Yeah.
This shift in conservative thinking is crucial, isn't it? Because it weakens that bipartisan consensus that, for decades, underpinned U.S. policy and aid, which means future aid packages will likely face much tougher fights in Congress.
Precisely. And while that alliance structure is showing cracks, the situation on the ground is also fragmenting fast. The IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, launched their expected ground attack on Gaza City. They're focused on defeating, I think the estimate is 3,000 Hamas fighters still there, but reports say 600,000 civilians remain in the city.
And meanwhile, in the West Bank, the whole vision of a Palestinian state seems to be decaying, physically and financially. The Palestinian Authority, the PA, the body meant to govern there, is barely hanging on.
And it seems this isn't accidental. Israel's government blocked the transfer of customs revenues. That's the PA's main money source. This forced them to cut salaries in half, delay school openings. Plus, Israeli officials are waging a kind of economic war, too, stopping Israeli banks from working with Palestinian ones, threatening the whole Palestinian banking system.
Wow, that sounds like an engineered collapse almost. And then there's the physical reshaping of the land. The E1 settlement block just got final approval. Remind us, what's the strategic importance of E1?
E1 is basically the physical nail in the coffin for the two-state solution idea. It's a big infrastructure project that will cut the West Bank center right in two. It physically disconnects major Palestinian cities like Bethlehem and Ramallah. Once that's built, a contiguous, viable Palestinian state becomes, well, geographically impossible.
So with the PA weakened and the land divided, what's the long-term plan being discussed?
Well, Netanyahu's own advisors are openly talking about setting up a Hebron emirate. Basically, a self-governing area, a municipality that would deal directly with Israel. It completely bypasses the PA, which isn't really functioning anyway. Feels like a trial balloon for, fragmentation. Breaking governance down, moving away from any central Palestinian authority, and potentially paving the way for incorporating the West Bank under the Israeli flag.
Yeah.
Completely against decades of diplomacy.
That's a disturbing picture of geopolitical, dissolution, really. Okay, let's pivot now to a different kind of acceleration, technological, and the financial models that are struggling to keep pace. We're talking about this massive accounting puzzle, right, at the heart of the AI cloud.
Right, we shift from fracturing alliances to, well, financial rules kind of buckling under the pressure of innovation. You've got the AI Big Five, Microsoft, Alphabet, Amazon, Meta, Oracle, trillion-dollar companies. They're pouring billions into AI hardware, the servers needed for these large language models. But the speed of improvement, especially from chip makers like NVIDIA, means this expensive hardware becomes obsolete incredibly fast, like yearly.
Yeah, the traditional accounting way is to assume a server rack is useful for, what, 5, maybe 7 years? But if NVIDIA is unveiling a much better chip every single year, the chips bought just last year are effectively worth much less, much sooner.
Exactly. That's the instability created by this hyper-innovation. Just look at this calculation.
Yeah.
If these newest super expensive servers were depreciated over just 3 years, instead of the usual, more optimistic assumption, the combined annual pre-tax profit of those 5 tech giants would drop by $26 billion.
Okay, $26 billion is a lot. But I'm seeing an even more staggering number. If you take the really extreme view, which some analysts and even NVIDIA's own boss, Jensen Huang, have hinted at, that the old chips are basically worthless after just 12 months. This accounting issue just explodes, doesn't it? How big could the hit be then?
Under that rapid depreciation scenario, it could potentially wipe out a staggering $4 trillion from their collective market value. It just highlights this huge, maybe masked risk underneath the whole AI investment frenzy. This isn't your standard market risk. It's more like a failure of traditional accounting principles gap to keep up with exponential tech growth.
$4 trillion. That is astronomical. So are we looking at the next tech bubble about to burst, or is this just, the new normal for risk in this super fast sector that investors need to accept? Why aren't the companies just adjusting their depreciation schedules now?
Well, that's the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it? They likely aren't adjusting because doing so would immediately hit their reported profits and, their stock prices. But the market isn't stupid. It understands this risk is building up. It might not be a bubble exactly like 2000, but it's definitely immense financial leverage built on hardware that's sort of rusting away much faster than the books show. For the average investor, the signal is pretty clear. Understand that the physical assets backing these huge valuations are surprisingly fragile.
Okay, so shifting from that Western financial paradox, let's look at a completely different approach to AI. India is emerging really fast as a kind of unique AI superpower. A different model for adoption, for innovation.
Yeah, India is already the #2 market in the world for both OpenAI and Anthropic. And the speed of adoption there is just wild. 92% of Indian office workers say they regularly use AI tools. Compare that to just 64% in America. This enthusiasm is fueled by really aggressive market capture, what the firms call blitzscaling.
Blitzscaling. Remind the listener, that means grabbing market share super fast with low prices, right? Cornering the user base. We're talking really affordable options designed for massive scale.
Get this. OpenAI sells its chatbot access in India for 1/5 of its cheapest U.S. plan. Grok is priced at 1/4 of the U.S. rate. The goal isn't immediate profit. It's capturing a flood of data and millions upon millions of users.
But what's really interesting, you said, is how Indian users aren't just consuming the tech, they're actually shaping it.
Exactly. Voice, not text, has quickly become the main way people interact with AI tools there. Part of that is apparently due to high rates of functional illiteracy. People find it easier to talk than type or read complex interfaces.
That's fascinating. So a local need difficulty with reading is actually driving the global development roadmap towards better voice models.
Precisely. And this focus on local needs is leading to what people are calling frugal, scalable innovation coming out of India. The idea is that these ultra-cheap, voice-first, high-volume AI models could become the blueprint for AI adoption across the whole developing world, kind of leapfrogging the expensive, text-heavy models that dominate in the West.
Okay, so from a multi-trillion-dollar headache in counting servers, let's turn to another area where established wisdom is being challenged. Public health. Decades of advice are suddenly looking, well, incomplete. We're talking about the sunlight paradox.
Yeah, for decades, the clear public health message has been, cover up, use sunscreen. And that was driven entirely by the proven and rising risk of skin cancer, which is real. But new research is forcing a much more nuanced conversation, especially in places far from the equator where winter sun is weak.
And this counter-evidence is pretty compelling. There was a huge study, right? 360,000 light-skinned Brits. It suggested that more UV exposure correlated with a 12 to 15% lower risk of dying from all causes, provided, crucially, you don't get sunburnt. That's a big statistical benefit against overall mortality.
Right, and the proposed biological reason behind this shifts the whole debate. The theory is that UV radiation helps your skin release nitric oxide into the bloodstream. And nitric oxide is a known vasodilator. It widens blood vessels, which lowers blood pressure.
So the sun exposure we were told to strictly avoid might actually be acting like a sort of natural blood pressure medication. And given that high blood pressure is a massive risk for heart disease, one of the world's biggest killers, that connection seems huge.
It really is potentially huge. And think about this. In high-latitude countries, you see a very clear seasonal pattern in heart disease deaths. They peak in winter when UV exposure is lowest, and presumably nitric oxide release is lower too. It suggests a direct measurable link between low sun exposure and major mortality risks.
So how are health authorities supposed to balance this potential benefit against the known risk of skin cancer? It sounds tricky.
It requires nuance, which frankly has been missing. Australia, a country obviously very concerned about skin cancer, has already started tweaking its public health advice. They're trying to account for the benefits and the importance of skin type. The scientific consensus seems to be growing. The message can't just be strict avoidance anymore. Both too little and too much sun are probably bad.
Okay, let's touch on one last substance that also messes with our simple good versus bad health assumptions. Nicotine, almost always linked with smoking and terrible health outcomes.
And for good reason. Nicotine is incredibly addictive, some say as addictive as cocaine, and delivering it via burning tobacco smoke is absolutely catastrophic for health, no question. But if you separate the nicotine itself from the smoke delivery method, the substance does show clear cognitive benefits in adults. It can boost mental performance, sharpen attention, reduce reaction times.
Right, that's the tricky dual nature. But the huge catch, obviously, is the impact on a brain that's still developing.
That is the absolute critical distinction. Animal studies strongly suggest that regular nicotine exposure during key developmental windows in the womb during adolescence can actually rewire the brain in unfavorable ways. It's linked to things like increased anxiety, depression-like behaviors, more impulsivity later in life.
So we've got this measurable cognitive plus for adults, but potentially serious, maybe permanent developmental harm for young people, which means even acknowledging this dual nature, the public health priority has to remain squarely on preventing youth exposure because the developmental risks are just so profound and long-lasting.
Exactly. It's another case where the old simple blanket assumption nicotine is just bad doesn't really capture the scientific complexity.
We have covered a huge amount of ground today. Wow. But the unifying theme really is this accelerated change, breaking down the old models. We saw it with major alliances like U.S.-Israel fracturing under new pressures. We saw it with tech creating these multi-trillion-dollar accounting questions because the financial models can't keep up. And we saw it in health science, flipping decades of advice on things like sunlight and nicotine.
Yeah, this stack of information really shows how fundamental assumptions are being challenged in geopolitics, finance, even basic biology.
Yeah.
The old rule books, they're getting outdated fast.
So as we wrap up, let's circle back to that idea of burden sharing. We saw it collapsing in the geopolitical sphere with the rise of America First thinking, but historically the U.S. has shouldered a disproportionate burden in funding other global public goods too, like, say, innovative medicines.
That's absolutely right. You look at many wealthy European countries, for example. They consistently underspend on innovative new drugs compared to the U.S. They're essentially, you could argue, relying on U.S. investment and U.S. market prices to fund the incredibly expensive R&D process. The U.S. spends close to 0.8% of its per-person GDP on innovative drugs. Italy, Spain, they're closer to 0.5%.
And the reality is, if those other wealthy countries matched the U.S. share, the boost to biopharma revenues would be massive. Tens of billions more dollars potentially flowing into new drug development, which benefits everyone globally.
It ties directly back to that NATO defense spending argument the isolationists were making earlier, doesn't it?
It does. Which leaves us with a final, maybe provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider. If collective security requires something like a NATO-style spending target for defense, should the development of life-saving medical innovation also require some kind of global spending commitment to ensure it continues? Is medical innovation itself a global public good that needs collective financial responsibility? Something to mull over.